A girl wakes up in a room with no memory and she can't use her legs. She's then told that she's been kidnapped and won't be released until she falls in love with her captor. Welcome to Nonstop Recap. Today we'll be recapping the 2018 psychological thriller Hippopotamus. The film opens with a girl waking up in a mostly blank room. She panics and tries to stand up but can't due to leg injuries. She suddenly hears the voice of a man saying that his name is Thomas Alcroft and he's kidnapped her. Thomas says that the woman, whose name turns out to be Ruby Watts, will remain captive until she falls in love with him. He then begins to tell Ruby information about herself, such as what she studied in school and what her parents do for a living. It's evident that Ruby has some memory problems and can't remember anything about how she got here, and she asks about why she can't walk. Thomas says that he severed her ligaments and he orders her not to move around if she ever wants to be able to walk around again. He then lets her know that her bag is across the room and he hasn't gone through any of her personal belongings. We see a meal with some pills beside Ruby, and Thomas tells her that 2 of them are painkillers and 1 of them is birth control that will stop her period. Ruby then learns that for the foreseeable future, she will be offered daily food. Thomas will help her wash and go to the bathroom, and she will wake up at 7 in the morning and go to bed at 11 at night. Thomas warns Ruby not to try and escape since she's 10 miles from the nearest household and her legs aren't working. As Thomas leaves the room, Ruby asks him if he assaulted her, and he promises her that he didn't. Now alone, Ruby looks around and notices that she has a metal bracelet on her wrist that says Ruby X. The next day, Ruby is still stuck in the same spot. We see that she's eaten her food but is refusing to take her pills. Thomas comes in to check on Ruby and is disappointed when he sees the pills are still there. He advises her to take them because her pain is only going to get worse, but Ruby ignores him. As Thomas leaves, Ruby asks him why he's doing this, but Thomas doesn't answer. Thomas goes into the room after Ruby falls asleep that night and gently rolls her into a fetal position so she can sleep more comfortably. The next morning, Thomas brings Ruby her breakfast and pushes her back in a sleeping position while she begins to groggily wake up. After Thomas leaves, Ruby's face morphs into a serious one, meaning that she was faking her grogginess. She's able to maneuver herself over toward her bag and goes through it, finding various items such as a mirror and her license. Ruby then notices a shadow from a window and realizes that Thomas is on his way back, so she quickly shoves everything back in her bag and puts it away, but a ball rolls away. Ruby scoots back to her original spot and is able to hide the ball right in the nick of time. Thomas brings her more food and notices that she's in pain. He pleads with her to take a high dose of pain medication, and she relents. Ruby has a nightmare that she's drowning, and when she wakes up, she has forgotten everything. She tries to go through the door only to rediscover her leg injury. Thomas is there and he explains the situation to her again. Ruby asks about what's been done to her legs, and Thomas tells her it was a necessary procedure to keep her from running away. She once again asks Thomas if he assaulted her, and he throws the chair with her bag in frustration before leaving the room. Now alone, Ruby notices the ball in her pocket and inspects her bracelet again. In a montage, we see the rest of Ruby's day, which consists of physical therapy, getting washed, and slamming the tennis ball against the door. The next day, Ruby realizes she has a head injury and tries to see it with the mirror from her bag. She isn't able to see anything and ends up smashing the mirror into smaller pieces to get a better look. She still can't see anything, but does notice that Thomas is spying on her through the crack in the door. She hides the broken mirror shard in her leg bandage and scoots back to her normal spot. But Thomas comes in and gives her more pills, causing her to pass out. Thomas begins playing an audio on repeat that discourages Ruby from moving and trying to escape. He cleans the room and passes out in the chair before getting woken up by his watch alarm. He then turns the audio off and pushes Ruby into a sitting position. After spending a few days with Thomas, Ruby gets the idea to mess with the sink and loosen one of the pipes. Thomas comes in to clean her mess, and Ruby asks him if she'll be forced to stay there for the rest of her life if she doesn't fall in love with him and jokes about her leg injuries. Seeing that she's feeling better since she's joking around, Thomas asks Ruby if he can get her anything, and she asks for a bed and a book. He then asks her about some drawings on the wall, and she says they're pretty, and Thomas says that Ruby is prettier. We then see Ruby with her bed and book, but as she reads the book, she begins to unlock some memories, and Thomas tells her that this used to be her favorite book. Thomas offers to help her regain her memories by finding things that will help trigger them. When Thomas brings Ruby her food, he asks her if there's a hot drink she'd like with her meal, and she asks for a specific kind of tea. Thomas immediately brings it to her, and Ruby unlocks another memory by drinking it. She asks him if he knew that would happen, and he says yes because it's the only thing she drinks, and he implies that he's done his research about her. Later, Ruby is going through her book when she finds a page that has random symbols scribbled on it. She puts her mirror shard against the page and sees that it says, "Don't trust him." Thomas then comes in with a table and begins to serve them dinner. He asks Ruby about her book and tries to rub her hand, but she pulls away. Thomas asks what's wrong, and Ruby asks him how many other girls he stalked and kidnapped before her. Thomas insists she's the only one who's ever been here, but Ruby continues to accuse him. Thomas then slams his fist on the table, cutting himself and startling Ruby. She then insists she doesn't want him to have done this to someone else because what they have is special. And Thomas insists that there's no one else before leaving. After he leaves, Ruby's face becomes serious and we see that she was acting the whole time. The next day, Thomas tells Ruby that her legs are healing, but they need a little more time. When Thomas leaves, Ruby takes off her bandages and sees that she doesn't have any injuries. She's able to walk to the door, which unlocks a memory of her being attacked and knocked out by a man. Ruby gives up the door and goes back to translating messages out of her book. She smears the ink accidentally and smells it, which unlocks a memory of her hiding something behind a brick. Ruby removes the brick and finds hundreds of matches, revealing that the messages were written using matches. During dinner that night, Ruby asks if she can have a candle to change the mood in the room. Thomas brings one and lights it with a match before asking if they can start over. Ruby begins to tell him about the drowning nightmare she keeps having and slyly grabs the match without Thomas noticing. We then see a montage of Ruby spending her days pretending to be weak with Thomas, but secretly working out, writing in her book, and practicing using her mirror shard as a weapon. We see Ruby doing push-ups, but when she hears Thomas coming, she runs to her bed. He suggests that he help her exercise her legs before dinner, and Ruby pretends to be weak as he guides her over to the chair. Thomas is happy with her progress and says that soon they'll be eating upstairs. At dinner, Thomas brings down a special meal and urges Ruby to try it. When she does, it unlocks a memory of her and Thomas on a date at a restaurant. In the memory, Thomas has Ruby close her eyes before gifting her with a necklace and kissing her forehead. In the present, Ruby says she vividly remembers the meal, and Thomas says it was for their anniversary. As she's brushing her teeth that night, Ruby looks at the two drawings and notices that one of them has the initials RAW in the corner. The next morning, Ruby looks through her window and sees Thomas in a rowboat. Later, Thomas talks about Ruby being inseparable from her books, and he begins to reminisce. As he talks about his memories of Ruby, we see a scene of her drawing while Thomas sleeps in her bed. Once she's sure he's out cold, Ruby starts to creep toward the door, but before she can grab the handle, Thomas says it's cold out and she'd need a jacket. Ruby grabs the tennis ball instead and tells Thomas that she can't sleep. We then cut to a scene of Ruby sleeping and Thomas covering her with a blanket, which triggers a memory of the two being intimate together. The next day, Thomas dances with Ruby, which unlocks a memory of the two of them dancing while Thomas tells her how much he loves her. Ruby tells Thomas she feels the same way and the two kiss. After gaining this memory, Ruby tells Thomas that she now fully believes they used to date. We then see Thomas explaining how the room's remote control works, and Ruby turns on the red lights and some slow music in order to give Thomas a lap dance, which ends with them making out. Ruby starts to cry and asks how they got here, and Thomas finally relents and promises to explain. We're shown the events of the past and see Ruby at a bar with her roommate Nick, who's openly flirting with her while she's waiting for Thomas. It's explained that Thomas missed his train and told Ruby that he'd be late, so Nick and Ruby went home to wait for him there while while Thomas's friend Rob drives him to Ruby's. While alone, Nick tries to kiss Ruby, but she resists. He then ends up brutally beating and assaulting her. Thomas shows up and finds this happening, leading him to killing Nick. Thomas gets his friend to drive Ruby back to Thomas's house, where she eventually regains her consciousness, but has lost her memory due to the assault. Thomas stops Rob from calling an ambulance and instead has him agree to drive Thomas and Ruby far up north, where Thomas plans on working to help Ruby regain her memory. Thomas takes Ruby to an abandoned island and spends his time learning about retrograde amnesia, which is where a victim forgets everything about their lives prior to an attack. He also learns that after sleeping for too long, Ruby's memory would reset back to right after the attack. His attempts to trigger her memories were a failure at first, but eventually he learned better strategies and learned how to control Ruby's sleep cycle so that she could learn for more than a day. Ruby first shows signs of response after being given her favorite book, but eventually Thomas decides he needs a blank slate. He constructs the White Room and comes up with the kidnapper scenario before resetting Ruby's memory by making her sleep a lot. Thomas tells Ruby that he lied about cutting her ligaments, and Ruby cries and caresses him, seemingly regaining the rest of her memory. The two sleep together that night and fall asleep. Ruby wakes up first and stabs Thomas repeatedly with her mirror shard. She tries to crawl away, but Thomas grabs her leg to stop her. She kicks him away and makes it outside and tearfully looks at the sky. She tries to get in a nearby boat to escape, but passes out before she can make it. She wakes up in a hospital where a doctor tells her that her surgery was a success, but she's suffered some short-term memory loss. The doctor walks out of the room, and it's revealed to be Thomas, who has come up with a new scenario to help Ruby regain her memory. Click one of the videos on screen for more.